So now what we're going to do is move into the next three segments. Actually, are a series of pairings of people that are doing interesting things in the space. So rather than a long-winded introduction, which I too often do, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, and then we'll kind of go into what you're both doing. So why don't you go first, Theron?
Sure. Theron Oliphant, Director of Platform Marketing at xAd, and basically what that means is xAd, a lot of people know us as either a search company or a ad network. What we've developed into is a true advertising platform for location-based advertising, and within that means that we're able to monetize advertising across pretty much the whole mobile ecosystem, and that's pretty much what we're doing at xAd.
And there's lots there we're going to dive into. David?
Founder and CEO of Placed. We've built a panel of 150,000 people that have installed an app that allows us to measure where they go in the physical world 24/7. So we see about 1,000 latitude and longitudes per panelist per day. So that gives us really deep insight in terms of the places where people go, the connections between places. And just to give you an idea, typical ad exchanges see anywhere from 2 to 3 locations per device ID per day. For us, we see 1,000, so it's 300 times more data that we work with. And then we put that and we combine that into products like insights, measuring where people go in the physical world, attribution, saw an ad, went into a store, and then targeting, really behavioral targeting using location.
And that attribution point is a good one, and that's kind of a buzz term we're hearing a lot now. I put out a paper on the subject of attribution about 6 months ago, and I think these guys both kind of thematically are going to talk about the different ways that we're kind of discerning ROI in more concrete terms, and that's really the name of the game, and these guys are doing very interesting things, very data-driven approach to get there. So let's drill down into that. First, we're going to focus on xAd. Theron, if you could talk a little bit about, just to kind of set some context, you mentioned xAd as a company, that the network you're running, quantify that for us in terms of reach, all that good stuff, and then we'll move further down.
Yeah, thank you. So as you see on the screen here, roughly over 3 million campaigns run with 1.5 million national and long tail advertisers, which pretty much translates down to everything from the largest brands down to the SMB single point locations. And we were one of the first location verification technologies in mobile, which allows us additionally to gather in lots of inventory, a great amount, up to 32,000 QPS, which is queries per second, which translates to billions of impressions per month. So we can act as a supply partner and a demand partner within the industry. And in terms of the size of our market, we're pretty much able to supply all of that inventory at a granular location level, which is up to smaller than 100 meter squares, if you will.
Sure. Well, that's actually a good segue into some definitions. I showed this slide earlier and kind of teased out the fact that when we talk about more granular flavors of location targeting, that's on the rise, and these are data from your network. But what do we mean by geo-precise? And that kind of gets to what you were just saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty loaded term in the industry right now. In geo-precise...
And often incorrect. It's kind of thrown around a lot, as David knows.
Yes, and geo-precise, we look at the world of geo-targeting, if you will, or precision targeting as really 3 different types of things. I think mobile 1.0 or geo 1.0 was just, hey, I have a store location and I would like to target that location and draw a circumference around it of 1 mile, 2, 3, 4 miles. I think what we've seen is that you get a lot of variation in the audience type. And when we start talking about location as audiences, that's where you start to develop what I call mobile 2.0, which is really, I'd say 3 different things. Number 1 is still, yes, targeting the location, but at a very granular level so that you can actually target people who are literally just in or in the immediate vicinity of that location. Then you have, the competitive conquesting aspect of I can target, that same level of granularity, all of my competitors. And then finally, some of the things that we're doing around real-world retargeting, looking at behavior and assigning audience characteristics to that behavior so that we can then go back and target those individuals specific to those types of retail locations.
I'm glad you said that because, and this is represented in your tagline, which I think is new as of like within the last year, right? And the
within the
tagline
last
is,
like 3 months.
Yeah, it's people plus places or something along those lines, the intersection of people and places. And I think that's interesting because we're hearing the rhetoric change around location targeting in a lot of the ways you just talked about, which is that location, not just as a means to target an ad right now because it's where someone's standing, but where were the last 20 places that person was, and what does that say about them as a consumer to profile them in different demographic groups or levels of affinity, as we're going to get into with David. But I think that's not only interesting because it's more multidimensional in how we use location, but it speaks the language of brand advertisers, because for years they've been doing audience targeting, but this is just a much more precise form of it. So rather than location as kind of a newfangled term that scares away a lot of Madison Avenue, it's one that brings the discussion in terms that they already are familiar with. Are you finding that to be the case in terms of its receptivity?
Exactly. I think one of the big things that the location-based market had a real problem with in the beginning was we had a nomenclature that just didn't fit in with the rest of the advertising and marketing world. And we had to take a look at ourselves and decide, what are we going to be? How are we going to support our customers and advertisers and brands? And really that came down to, we need to look at our technologies as supporting the way that they already talk about the industry and the market. And we can do that by creating what you talked about, some of those strategies that allow us to look at audience characteristics, demographics, psychographics. The behavior of how people move throughout the world is really interesting.
Absolutely.
And at xAd, we utilize something pretty unique. We actually power all search pretty much in mobile that's not Google. And that allows us to see intent in various places. So, and I think we'll talk about it a little later, but the idea of point of interest being dynamic as opposed to a static location.
Sure. Now, David, we're going to go into the examples of how you are actually audience targeting as well in lots of different ways. Anything to say about kind of the virtues of doing it while we're on that subject?
I think it's really about moving past proximity. I think proximity, like you said before, is it's 1.0. It's actually looking at behaviors. Where do people go before they go to Home Depot? Yes, within 5 miles it converts well. We've seen that within our data set to say if you target ads nearby a store, it has a higher conversion rate. But you're getting a lot of that. It's almost like retargeting at the end of the day. You're getting the people that you might have already gotten, plus you get some new people in the door. What's more interesting is how do I get them before they decided to go between a Lowe's or a Home Depot? How do I get them when they're considering what they're going to do next versus already waiting till they're there?
Absolutely. Well said. So let's go into a case study now. And this is a slight gear shift in terms of another thing you guys are doing, or actually you alluded to this, your smart fence technology. Taking what was, what we used to kind of refer to, or we still do as geofences, instead of just a radius, a circle, it's a lot smarter because, the real world does not work and snap into these kind of, geometric shapes that we're, used to. So talk about what happened here.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that we were really concerned with at xAd was, you already have a limited amount of, very granular location inventory. How can we reduce ad wastage for our customers? And that takes into account the idea that everyone in an immediate vicinity is not necessarily interested in your product. There are various audiences that can often live and matriculate fairly close together. So what this actually shows is the green outlined areas are locations where we actually saw intent within the immediate vicinity specific to vehicle shopping. And the orange kind of, or yellow in the middle, is actually what would be a typical geofence, and any of the orange spots would be some of the ad wastage where we didn't see intent. And as you see some of the metrics here, we were able to drive a great CTR, but more importantly, and I think this is going to be a theme today, talking about the secondary action rates.
Yes.
What kind of behavior were we actually able to contribute to influencing? And those things are often click to calls, maps, how do I get to the dealership, all of the things that produce higher engagement with the advertisement.
Absolutely. So that's pretty telling. We have another case study from you I'm going to skip over and come back to so we can move on to David. So David, you talked about kind of what you did at a high level. Tell us about the kind of the panel approach and some of the granularities about what you've put together?
Yeah, so from a panel-based approach, it actually gives you a lot more data than if you rely on third parties. So panel-based approach, we're on device, we have opt-in from the user. So FTC, Privacy Foundation have both said this is a very clean way to actually acquire location data. And we see 300 times more location data than most ad exchanges do on a daily basis when you look at an individual user. And that's key because when you take a single latitude and longitude and you tie it to the closest place, you have a 95% error rate. So that means if you pick the closest business and you say they were there, it actually is wrong 95% of the time. And the reason why is someone could be walking, someone could be waiting for the bus, it could be a red light, they could be at the store next door, they could be in the middle of a Walmart, but it shows the location is 2 blocks away. So all of those data points make it really difficult to figure out where somebody is in the physical world, especially when you only have one single point.
Yeah.
So you need to be able to see that entire path. And so what we've done is, through that panel-based approach, we actually can ask our panelists questions to say, where were you at Tuesday at 2 o'clock? Were you at Walmart, McDonald's, Starbucks, the businesses that were around that location? And they respond back, and that helps us train our model. So it's really getting that feedback loop. And that's been critical because we work directly with retailers. We work with 4 out of the top 12 retailers in the US where we measure of the customers that go into their store, where else they go,
Yep.
and they compare us against their store counters. So really, at the end of the day, if you can't match their store counter number,
Yep.
they're not going to believe your number at all. So really, we've done that step.
Now, what I love about this is it brings a lot of the kind of online metrics that we're so used to into the physical world, which has always been kind of the holy grail. Now, and it's been referred to as like the comp score for the real world and along those types of lines. So how are you getting all of these opt-ins? You're working through app developers, correct? Or probably a variety of ways, but that's probably a question people are wondering, how do you get this great number of people that are opting in to share their location?
Yeah, so we've got 2 apps anyone in the audience can install. First one's called Panel App. It's on iOS and Android, over 1 million installs. That's really the traditional ComScore Nielsen model. You go in, you provide some information, you opt in, you share your data, and we measure where you go.
Yep.
We have another app called Give to Charity, which gives us a more older, affluent audience where instead of you getting paid directly, you can pick a charity of your choice. Mm-hmm. And the third is we partner with third-party apps where they take premium features where it might have cost 99 cents or $1.99, but instead of paying that, they can actually trade their location data for that premium feature. So we see a lot of opt-ins where we work with baby naming apps, where if you want 2014 names, you got to pay 99 cents, or you can trade your location data. So it really diversifies the base that we work with.
Are you finding, I see this happening, but are you finding the resistance level is going down as there's a cultural acclimation to this kind of value exchange? I share my location, I get something of value. Are you finding this kind of, the resistance is breaking down overall?
I think it's key. I think when people understand that there's a clear value exchange, it's a little bit different from the cookie. Cookie was opt-out, mobile location, it's really opt-in, because they're opting in when they install the app to share the location data. They're opting in to give that to Placed. And really, it's been great response. Like when we get the FTC that says, hey, this is not a bad approach to how you're doing it. Privacy Foundation says it's the perfect model for privacy. You can't complain.
That's a good sign. So, you alluded to this a few times. The way that you are mapping out affinity through the different places people are going, and this is an example of how that's actually been applied. Talk a little bit about what you did here.
Yeah, so we're working with a high-end retailer, and what they wanted to do was understand females 14 to 24, they go into their store, they see that foot traffic coming in anecdotally, but they weren't buying anything. It was actually one of the worst performing categories in their store. So they asked us, hey, we've got a couple of hypotheses in terms of what's going on. So what we did was we looked at panelists that were 14 to 24 that visited their store, and we looked at where else do they go in the physical world, what places over-index. And what you see, it's real-world showrooming. They're going to Old Navy, they're going to Ross, they're going to American Eagle Outfitters, Burlington Coat Factory. So what they're doing is they're going into the high-end department store, looking at the latest styles, and then they're shopping elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. We're going to go back to that in a second too, some actually visualizations of what you've done there. I think I'd also like to dwell on something. This is a slide you sent me, which I think is key to a theme that I've been seeing a lot, which is that, I mentioned earlier the adoption of advertisers into mobile and into location targeting. In a lot of cases, when it's not happening, it's because they're simply measuring the wrong things. Mm-hmm. So if you're just looking at the things you're accustomed to, like impressions or clicks, you might be missing out on a true, clear picture of ROI. So talk about what's happening here.
Yeah, so we work with a number of partners. So we actually don't sell media. We think you have to disconnect media from attribution because there's an inherent conflict of interest. So we work with partners like xAd, where we measure the effectiveness of their campaigns to say, saw an ad in our panel, what did they then do in the physical world? And typically people optimize on click-through rate. It's the easiest metric that's out there if people understand to use that. Campaign number 1 was a starting point. Then they ran another campaign. click-through rate actually went down. And then if you look at the blue line, campaign number 3, click-through rate had the lowest click-through rate out of all 3 campaigns. And what traditionally would happen from a agency or advertiser standpoint is they cancel the buy, or they renegotiate a buy. But it has the highest in-store conversion rate. So I think this is key because click-through rate has no correlation with in-store visitation.
Totally.
And I think with your number that you showed for 2018, where you say local is going to overtake kind of the mobile pie in terms of targeting, this is going to be key. It's the ability to actually attribute the value of using location to say, are they going into store? Is it generating me more revenue?
And I think the key point is by looking at the wrong thing, if that red line wasn't there, as you said, that campaign would have been shut off, and probably shut off prematurely.
Yeah,
Darren?
and I would only add to what David said is that one of the reasons we really like working with a company like Placed is because of the richness of their data, right? We can take this in-store visit metric and really understand at the demographic level who was converting. It's not just in aggregate against the run of network we saw an uptick, which of course you should. Your targeting should work fairly well, right? But against a like set of the exposed to the control, it's got to be equitable. And we saw really good results with that, and appreciate what they're doing there.
That makes sense. We're winding down on time here. David, I want to give you the chance to go through some of this visualization. We'll skip past this. So we've talked about geofences and kind of the smart fencing that you're doing as opposed to kind of the old just kind of circle around a business. So David, you have taken this traditional approach and given it a lot more dimension in some of the ways that we already discussed. Taking retailers like JCPenney, Kohl's, Macy's, what are the other places that their customers are visiting, and being able to therefore say, where the affinity lies, and then that as a means to advertising in the right places. So as opposed to the previous slide of just those circles, by applying these methods, you've come up with something much more multidimensional that looks like this. So talk about what's going on here.
Yeah, so when you look at those pinpoints there, those are JCPenney locations in New York. And then we looked at our panelists that visited the JCPenney stores, and where else do they go in the physical world? And compare that then against the overall New York population. And those green bars represent locations that have a high index to visit a JCPenney store. And what's good about our model is the highest bars are at the JCPenney store location.
Makes sense.
Our model's working, that's good. But then you see these other locations in southern Manhattan where they spike up, where you're like, hey, this is really interesting. What's going on there? There's no store there, but there's a lot of activity there that shows a high index. And what happens in those scenarios, we looked at this a little bit closer, those are subway stops. So what's happening is people live outside of Manhattan. They're going into the city.
That's where they emerge?
Yeah, they come out of there, then they go shop at JCPenney, and then they go back home. But they don't live on the island. So what you're seeing is, for JCPenney customers in New York, they're really transient. They're coming into the city and then leaving. And then from a targeting standpoint, we partner with xAd with this, is it gives you the ability to kind of expand past that geofence.
Yeah. Now, what I love about this too is not just finding the actual places where it's more opportune to target advertising, but just the overall lesson, panning back, and that you learn things that were otherwise not obvious to the advertiser, to you, to anyone. But the data-driven approach starts to reveal some of these things that you wouldn't otherwise know. So that's great. We're out of time. Please join me in thanking these two individuals.
Thank you.